Subqueries are one of those very interesting topics out there in T-SQL development. And if you grab a group of T-SQL developers, bring them into a room, say 20 of them, and just mention subqueries and say, what are your thoughts on subqueries? You're going to watch that room divide almost down the middle into those who don't like them and become, upset, and those who like them and see them as the solution to every complex query problem. I've seen this throughout my career. And it's simply because there is this ongoing debate between when should I use a subquery, when should I rewrite the subquery as a join query. Now, we will take a look at that a little bit later on, but for now, just understand that a subquery is a nested query. Now, there's a ton of power in subqueries. And so what I want to do in this video is help you get your head around what they are. And then in the next, 4 or 5 videos, I'm going to do lots of examples of these things so that you can kind of get your head around how they work and what you can do with them. A subquery is where the result set of one query is fed to another query, or one query uses the result set of another query, however you want to say that. Now this saves a few programming steps, because if we don't use a subquery and we just write this out in code, we would have to create a variable. Well, here we don't have to create a variable. Then we don't have to execute a query to load that variable. Then we don't have to store the result in that variable and then refer to that variable in another query to get the result set that we want. A subquery does all of this for us automatically, if you will. Now, there are a couple of terms you need to understand to figure out what people are talking about when they're talking about subqueries and documentation, or when you're trying to get your head around how these things are working. And let's take a look at this very simple subquery. Notice what's happening here. We are going to select the first name, the last name, and the business entity ID from the person table. That's the person schema.person table, where the business entity ID is in a list of ID numbers. Well, we're using the keyword in right here, and we talked about in a little earlier in the course. Go watch the video on in and like if you haven't seen that, because that will explain what those are. And the name of that video is using like and in, by the way. But instead of putting a list of literal IDs out here, we're going to generate those as the result set of a query. So notice in parentheses, we're going to execute a query here to load the list for this in keyword. Select distinct salesperson ID from sales.salesOrderHeader. Well, if you look at these tables in the diagramming tool out there, you will notice that the salesperson ID is the same number that's being used for business entity ID in another table. Now, we could talk about database design and so forth. But again, take that same group of folks that we talked about arguing about subqueries and have them discuss database design architecture, and you'll have the same argument. So anyway, we figured out that these two IDs are the same. They're just named differently in different tables. So we're going to select the distinct values from sales order header. That's going to return a list that we use to feed this in keyword to feed this query. Now, here are the two terms you need to understand. First of all, the outer query is that top query. It is the one that's consuming the data from the subquery. The actual subquery is the inner query. Now, the inner query has parentheses around it. Make sure you burn these two words into your brain and you understand the position of these things. The outer query is where the query starts. It's the main query, if you will. You will hear terms out there in documentation of outer query, main query, all those sorts of things. And then the inner query is the one that is providing data to the outer query. So what's going to happen here when you execute this, the inner query is going to run one time, create a list that's then consumed by the outer query. Now, there are two types of subqueries that you can use in T-SQL and SQL Server 2012. There's a simple subquery, which is what we just looked at, and a correlated subquery. Now, subqueries can return result sets in 3 different forms. Scalar, which is single value, multi-valued, which is more than one value, obviously, or table valued, which is basically returns a table of data, a normal return set that we normally see with queries. Now, a simple subquery is a subquery where the inner query produces a result set that's used by the main query. Notice it produces a single result set, but you got to watch terminology here. A single result set is considered a single value, a list of values from a single column, or a true or false value. Okay, so a single result is a single value, a list of values from a single column, or a true or false value. Correlated subquery is one that depends on a value in the outer query. And this kind of reverses it. The subquery tends to run over and over and over, but it runs one time for each value that it sees in the outer query. And is it a little hard to understand? Yes, you'll just have to see an example. The best way to see all this stuff is to see examples. And so coming up in the next, like I said, 4 or 5 videos, we're going to dig into these, write some examples as simply as possible, because once you get your head wrapped around it simply and it's clicking, then you can go and add some complexity to it and keep up with what's going on. So that's the basics on understanding subqueries. And now let's dig into these things.